Hello there, class. Dr. Dutton coming to you for what is our last and final module, Module 8, the book of Deuteronomy. I'll have a few closing words at the end of this lecture, but let's jump in and start talking about Deuteronomy here. Now, at the outset, I want to share a story with you. You know, when I was growing up, I used to watch Sesame Street a lot, and they had this segment on there called Which One of These is Not Like the Others? And they would show 4 pictures, like 3 of them would be circles, and 1 of them would be a square, and you had to pick out which one of the 4 was not like the others, which obviously is a square. Well, if we were playing that game with the Pentateuch, Deuteronomy would be the square. It is definitely not like the other books. Now, that's not to say that Moses didn't have a lot to do with the authorship of Deuteronomy. However, I think as we begin to discuss this and as you study a little bit more about the authorship theories of Deuteronomy, you'll see that it really is a little bit different than the other 4 books. Well, the setting of the book is all in the same place. It takes place on the plains of Moab. Moab is just to the east of the Jordan River. So Israel is poised on the east side of the Jordan River, getting ready to cross over into the land of Canaan. And the whole book is a series of sermons or messages that are preached by Moses to the people of Israel before they go into the land. And the whole purpose of the book is Moses challenging the people to live by the covenant to which they agreed at Mount Sinai once they have entered the land. There's about to be a big transition, a big generational shift here from the generation that came out of Egypt. All of them have died. And now it's this new generation, everyone who was 20 years or older, that has wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, that they're the ones that are getting ready to cross over into the promised land. Well, Deuteronomy has a unique style of theology that we can also see in several other books that follow it. The basic theology consists of 4 points. The first one is that God elected Israel. He chose them as his covenant people because of his love for them. He chose them before Mount Sinai, brought them out of Egypt, brought them to Mount Sinai, entered into this special, unique relationship with them. Because of that special, unique relationship, Israel's responsibility, their commitment, is to follow the covenant. This is the agreement that they made at the base of Mount Sinai with the Lord in a cloud covering the mountain there. Well, the real heart of the theology of Deuteronomy is this third point. If they obey the covenant, they will be blessed. If they disobey, they will be cursed. There is a cause and effect that Deuteronomy utilizes. Do what God says, things will go well. If you don't, then they won't. And the arena in which this will take place is the land. The land is a huge theme in the book of Deuteronomy, and that's where the people are going to experience the blessing or the cursing. Now, I mentioned that Deuteronomy is a little bit of a rare bird when it comes to the Pentateuch. And so the biggest question about Deuteronomy is its authorship the same as the rest of the Pentateuch, or is there something else going on here? Now, there are those who agree that the book of Deuteronomy is substantially Mosaic, written by Moses before his death, obviously. However, the language, the vocabulary, and the style are very different. than the other 4 books in the Pentateuch. This is also the only book in the Pentateuch that contains absolutely no narrative whatsoever. There's no story in the book of Deuteronomy. It's this series of sermons preached by Moses. And it definitely reads as if it was written with someone who is looking back and remembering. Now, that's not to say, again, that Moses didn't do a whole lot to write this, but there's definitely some signs of editing in the book. And so perhaps the editor is taking what Moses has written and shaping it and crafting it into a different form. Well, the second theory is that the book of Deuteronomy is really a product of the 7th century BC, so sometime in the 600s. And most of these theories I don't really buy into. However, I think this one actually has something to it, simply because of what we read in 2 Kings. 2 Kings 22 is the story of one of the only 2 good kings in all of history of Israel or Judah. The other one is King Hezekiah. This one is King Josiah, who is Hezekiah's great-great-grandson. Well, it's during the time of King Josiah that he orders renovation of the temple. Josiah's grandfather, King Manasseh, was a terrible king, practiced all sorts of idolatry. We can read about him in 2 Kings 21. And so the temple was in great disrepair. So Josiah ordered that the temple be repaired, renovated. Well, while the priests are engaged in this, they find something called the Book of the Law. The theory is that this was all of, or maybe just part of, the book of Deuteronomy. Josiah is disturbed when he reads the law, and you get the impression that this is the first time that he's ever read the law. He follows the instructions of the law. They celebrate Passover for the first time in generations. And Josiah brings about major reform religiously there in Jerusalem and Judah. And the theory is that this book was placed in the temple by these righteous priests to bring about reform. After 60 years of King Manasseh, Josiah's grandfather, and his idolatry. Now, if you like conspiracy theories, this is a pretty good one. And again, I think that there might be something to this. If you remember early in the term, in our discussion of the documentary hypothesis, this would be the D source. And again, I don't buy into the documentary hypothesis, but I do think there is something to this. There are a couple of futuristic references in the book of Deuteronomy that sound as if they are from the time of the temple. For instance, there are a couple of different references to the place where the Lord will establish his name, like this one in Deuteronomy 16:2. This is the language of the covenant that God makes with David, that he's going to establish Jerusalem and the temple. He's going to make that the place where his name and where he himself dwells. But Deuteronomy's way, way, way before that. I mean, we're talking almost 1,000 years before this takes place. There's also the issue of the monarchy. Deuteronomy 17 has an attitude of, well, when you get into the land and you decide that you want to have a king, whereas the book of Samuel is very negative towards the idea of having a human king. So it almost seems out of order there. It seems as if 1 Samuel was written first, then Deuteronomy later. Deuteronomy makes it sound like, well, you're going to ask for a king anyway, so here's what you need to do about it. Whereas Samuel has great prohibition against having a king. So these and others almost make it sound as if Deuteronomy was written much later than the rest of the Pentateuch. A final theory was proposed by a German scholar named Martin Noth. And he suggested the idea of what he called a Deuteronomic historian. And he sees a link between Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, the 4 books of what is called the former prophets section of Israel's history. He believes that Deuteronomy should be grouped with Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings instead of Genesis through Numbers, and that Deuteronomy and these 4 books should be called the Deuteronomic history because their language is so similar and their theology is so similar. He reasons that this Deuteronomic history was put together in its final form during the exile in Babylon by one editor. So this would be quite a long time after the time of Moses, 700-800 years perhaps. And he calls this one editor the Deuteronomist, or the Deuteronomic historian. Now, today, most contemporary scholars do acknowledge that there is a very strong link between Deuteronomy and Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. But few contemporary scholars hold to one author, although you will see references in commentaries and things like that to the Deuteronomist. And that's Martin Note's theory here. The more popular idea is that a group of historians produced this body over a long period of time. Now, for those who don't like the idea of separating Deuteronomy from the rest of the Pentateuch, Note proposed the idea of what's called a hexateuch. 6 books, starting with Genesis, ending with Joshua. Genesis begins with the creation, the selection of Abraham, then you go through the Exodus from Egypt, the wilderness wanderings, entrance into the land in Joshua, and by the end of Joshua, all the people have settled in the land. So some have suggested that the Pentateuch should really be a hexateuch. By the way, Note's most influential work is called the Deuteronomic History, which outlines everything that I just talked about there. Some scholars today even expanded on this work, and they refer to something called the Ananateuch. The first 9 books of the Bible are intended to be one section. Whereas, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings talk about entrance into the land, and then Kings ends with their removal from the land. Well, whether you want to buy a Pentateuch, which I do, or a hexateuch, or an Ananateuch, you can't dismiss Note's influence on the field of Old Testament studies. He has had quite an impact on it, even if you don't buy into the theory of the Deuteronomic historian. So as you can see, there's a lot of authorship questions regarding the book of Deuteronomy that aren't really discussed with Genesis through Numbers. Well, let's talk about the content of the book, which won't take us very long because, again, you have to remember much of what is in Deuteronomy is repeated material. In other words, you can find it in at least one. Some of the material you can find in more than one of the books of the Pentateuch. Well, the first 4 chapters of Deuteronomy is one long section. It's one long sermon where Moses recounted the entire history of the Israelites, starting with Abraham, through Egypt and the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings that brings them to where they are, poised, ready to go into the land of Canaan. And so the first 4 chapters of Deuteronomy are basically just a review of everything that we've talked in this term, starting with Abraham all the way up until the people are ready to go into the land of Canaan. Well, one of the unique sections in the book of Deuteronomy is one of the most important sections in all of the Old Testament. It is called the Shema. The Hebrew word Shema means hear or obey. And we'll take a look at this passage here in just a second, but it begins with this revelation of monotheism, the oneness of God, that God in and of himself is self-sufficient, self-sustaining, that he is self-reliant, and that he is one. This is not a pantheon or a multitude of gods. And this is one of the great contributions of the Jewish faith to the world, really, that God himself is one God, not one among many. Well, the passage continues. Love the Lord with all your heart, your soul, and your strength. These commandments that the Lord is giving to them are to be on their hearts. They are to impress them on their children. They're to talk about them when they sit at home, when they walk along the road, when they lie down, and when they get up. They're supposed to tie them as symbols on their hands and bind them on their foreheads. Write them on the door frames of their houses and on their gates. That's in Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9. So, with this revelation that the Lord, the God of Israel, is one, there is a human response that comes with that. To love God, to obey God, and to teach their children about God. But there's more to it than that. The Torah is the prime element. It is the most important part of the faith of the Hebrews. And when we talk about the Torah, we're talking about the law. We're talking about what Moses brought down from Mount Sinai. And it says that they are to place signs on their hands and their foreheads and their doors. And Orthodox Judaism takes this very seriously. And so you will see Orthodox Jews who have these little boxes called phylacteries. This is from when Bob Dylan visited Israel a few years ago, and he was at the Western Wall and put a little phylactery on his head. You also see here on the arm, and some place it on their hands, others place it on their forearms. Just a few years ago, there was an Alaska Air flight that had to divert because during a time of prayer, one of the Jewish passengers got up and started to put the phylactery on his arm, and they thought he was strapping a bomb on himself. So this is still practiced among Orthodox Jews. They're also to place it on their door frames and their gates. And again, they took this very literally, and so they have created something called mezuzahs. And a mezuzah is a box on a door frame containing the Shema. So all over Israel, you will see little tiny boxes like this with a couple of screw holes for them to be mounted on the door frame. And inside of it is a little piece of paper rolled up that has Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9 written on it. And as practicing Jews walk out the door, they will touch this, and they will touch their mouths as well. Again, they take that scripture very literally, that they're to be talking about this and to be thinking about it all the time. And so these phylacteries and mezuzahs become signs of what they're supposed to do with their hands and their heads and their homes and their kids. And the Torah, the law, is to be at the center of all of their lives. So that is the Shema. Very, very important passage in Deuteronomy. Maybe one of the most important in all of the Old Testament. Well, another theme that we see in Deuteronomy that we don't see in the other books is the concept of the tithe. Now, this word tithe, that's not a Hebrew word. This comes from an old Anglo-Saxon word. In Hebrew, it just literally says 1/10. And here, according to Deuteronomy chapter 14, the Israelites were to bring 1/10 of all their produce, so fruits, vegetables, grain, and they're to bring them to a central sanctuary. Again, there's a reference to a central sanctuary when there isn't one yet. And the family and the priests eat that meal together. Again, this is how the priests survived. They didn't have land of their own. So it was the tithe was partially to provide for them. Well, every third year, the tithe of a family was to be put in a local food bank that could be visited by those who didn't have land for themselves or couldn't afford food for themselves. So the Levites, the priests, foreigners from outside of Israel's borders, orphans, widows, these people would be able to go to this tithe bank and be able to take some of the food for themselves in order to survive. So, really, what you have here is you have a way to not only express gratitude to God, which these first fruits were certainly a part of, but also to provide for those who couldn't provide for themselves. It's important to remember that this is the Lord's idea. He's always been on the side of those who are not able to take care of themselves, the poor and the landless, the refugee living within the borders. Well, in medieval England, they created something called tithe barns, which is not dissimilar from what they would have had in Israel, although it wouldn't have been quite this ornate, probably. But you get the idea. People could come and visit and take what they needed in order to survive. One of the other sections that you don't see in any other part of the Pentateuch are the requirements for the ideal rulers. Again, chapter 17 of Deuteronomy talks about what the king of Israel should be like, when in reality, having a king was never what God wanted in the first place. So again, this kind of leads to the idea that perhaps Deuteronomy was written later. Also, if you look at the requirements of the king, that he's supposed to be chosen by God, he must be an Israelite, he can't multiply his wealth in the way wealth was moneyed then, like wives and horses and money, that he had to be a student of Torah. It actually says that he had to carry around with him, the king did, a handwritten copy of the law by his own hand. He had to have that with him at all times. And he was not supposed to have any attitude of superiority. He couldn't use his position for himself. He had to use it to serve the Israelite people. Well, when you look at this, pretty much every king, with the exception of maybe David, did the last three, especially Solomon. There are some theories that say that really the book of Deuteronomy, or at least chapter 17, was written as a corrective to what Solomon was doing, multiplying his wealth, ignoring the law, having this attitude of superiority. Or regardless of what you think about that, it certainly gives a very clear list of requirements for the king that most of the kings did not live up to, except for perhaps the first two. Well, by the time it gets to chapter 28 is a list of blessings and curses. Remember, that's one of the fundamental concepts of Deuteronomy. If you obey, you'll be blessed. If you disobey, you'll be cursed. Well, in chapter 28, as in most ancient documents, the curses section is twice as long as the blessings section. I guess that's because as human beings, we tend to respond better, or our response is stronger to what will happen to us if we don't do something, to punishment, not to benefit. And it just reads like a litany of everything that's going to go wrong in your life. The Lord will send curses, confusion, rebuke in everything you put your hand to. You'll be destroyed by sudden ruin. You'll have a plague with diseases, and it goes on and on and on and on. And again, this is to challenge the people to be faithful to the covenant once they get into the land, with this long list of what's going to happen to them if they aren't. Well, the last few chapters are a series of appendices. They tell about the selection of Joshua to be the successor of Moses after Moses is gone. Chapter 31, Moses read the law to the people one last time after chapter 29, where he leads them in a covenant renewal, where the people agree again. It's not enough for the past generation to have agreed to the law. The present generation has to agree to live by it as well. Chapter 33, a beautiful chapter where Moses blessed each one of the 12 tribes individually. And then the book of Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch ends with Moses going up onto the top of Mount Nebo, looking across the Dead Sea into the land of Canaan. This comes after 40 years in Egypt, the first 40 years of his life, the second 40 years as a shepherd in the wilderness, and then the last 40 years as a shepherd again, just a different kind of shepherd, leading God's people through the wilderness. And so at the age of 120, according to Deuteronomy 34:7, Moses went up on top of this mountain range called Nebo. He's able to look across into the promised land, but not actually to be able to go into it because of what happened in Numbers chapter 20, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Now, on the top of what is considered to be Mount Nebo today, just east of the Jordan River, there is a monastery that dates way, way back. It's been redone now. There's a monument to Moses that's there. But Deuteronomy 34:6 tells us that God himself buried Moses, but no one knows where. So you can't really visit the grave of Moses because nobody really knows where it is except for the Lord. And so I wanted to finish today by reading the last section of Deuteronomy and the last section of the Pentateuch, which is where we say goodbye to Moses, who has been the preeminent figure of the Pentateuch. He doesn't appear in Joshua, but he is, for the most part, the central character, other than the Lord himself, through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so, Deuteronomy ends like this. And if you remember from our discussion, this part was probably added later by an editor instead of Moses writing about himself. The book ends by saying that since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those miracles and signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh, to his officials, and to the whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of Israel. Think what you want to, say what you want to about Moses, but he is one of the key, central, most important figures in all of the Old Testament and in all of Judaism as well. Definitely within the Pentateuch, as we have discussed. Well, class, that's going to do it for our video lectures on the Pentateuch. I hope that you have enjoyed these. I hope that they have spurred your interest and that you will do more research on those elements that we've talked about that have been interesting to you. I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank you for being a part of this class. And I'll say goodbye to you in an announcement video a little bit later. But I definitely want to tell you how much I've enjoyed this. And I hope that you have too. And I wish you the very best as you continue in your studies here at Houston Christian University. Have a great day.